watching Nate and the way he looks right now, obviously, I mean, what do you tell him in terms of his development and where he needs to go from here?
Yeah, so again, I think information, oftentimes you try to use it in your favor, right? So there was like this perception that Nate was like this skinny guy. And, I think at one point he weighed 175 pounds. He got to the combine, and I think he was 184, 186, something like that. I don't look at it as much of a problem. I think there's an opportunity for us to get him stronger. I think we do a good job of that. Again, I saw a guy that was a competitive player. I saw a guy that wanted to be a physical player. Getting stronger is only going to help his game. So if you love his game now, then you have to be really excited about what he could be. So I think his future is very, very bright. He's a sponge. He's going to want to work in the weight room. We've got some great mentors with him down there. Guys like Roquan and Marlon's a great example of a guy that's always trying to improve. I think Sarah Snyder, our dietitian, is the best in the business, and she'll help him quite a bit. And I don't really see it as a problem.
Eric, related to that, you guys historically have drafted very well when it comes to first-round corners. I mean, they've all either made multiple Pro Bowls or helped you win Super Bowls. Plenty of talented corners that go in the first round every year. What do you think is key to guys, one, making the transition to the next level, and two, in the case of some of the guys you've drafted in the past, that they've made that transition pretty quickly? Playing a lot for you sooner rather than later.
I think corners have to have traits. They've got to have some outrageous traits. Marlon was just a big physical guy who ran fast, a little stiff, but a physical, tough competitor. Jimmy had, freakish size and just a natural athlete, and could cover and ran well. Chris McAllister had, just unbelievable size and explosive ability to knock the ball out. Dwayne Starks, I scouted Dwayne when he came out. It was a long time ago. But Dwayne had, pound for pound, was one of the toughest guys and ran extremely fast. But he was tough, feisty, competitive. I look at Nate as just great feet, speed, coverability. Guys don't get open against him. He can just flat out cover, and that's really important. His quality, his superpower is when he's covering a guy, there's going to be very little space. He's got ball skills. He anticipates well. He can close, and he can recover. So I think, you want an all-around guy. You want a guy that does everything pretty well. But when you're talking about a first-round corner, you want traits that will put them ahead of everybody else. And I think he shows that.
Eric, you've mentioned Torrey Smith. You talked about Montez and the comp there. Can you just explain a little bit more what you see, similarities that you see between those two guys?
Size and speed, the big playability outside. Take the top off, catch the ball and go, can break a tackle. I love Torrey's game. We were so happy to draft Torrey when we did. He fell to us. It was the longest day. And we had drafted Jimmy, and then, that draft, I had torn my Achilles. I was highly medicated. I had just had surgery, just right before that. That draft was, my son had just been born. My wife was going to divorce me because I had torn my Achilles and couldn't drive. And we got both those guys. And it was controversial with Jimmy, and then we turned around and got Torrey. And we were very happy. Torrey saved me because the whole fiasco with Jimmy was, the pick and the trade and all that. We had the free fourth-round pick. It fell through. But Torrey was a guy that we all loved because he was a great kid, number one. Phenomenal kid. Great story. Had some adversity, overcame it. Size, speed. He had some drops. He didn't have the cleanest hands. But he was a phenomenal kid, great practice player, great teammate. He made big plays when they counted. You could count on him. He was a glue guy. And I just think Tez has a lot of those same qualities.
When you look at offensive linemen, just the repetition and the skill set and what goes into that, and then you look at someone like Roger that is with a left-handed quarterback, does that speak to his athletic ability to be able to kind of flip it?
Yeah, I think so. I'm a big believer in adjustments and being able to change on the fly and spatial awareness, and at every position, really. I think it's a critical thing. It's a critical component. of athletic ability. We don't talk about it enough, but the great athletes have an ability to contort their bodies and adjust and play different positions. I mean, I go back to when Marshall got hurt, and you know, he couldn't play right guard because of the injury that he had, and he said, "But I think I could play left guard. You know, I think I could do something else and just use my other arm." That's incredible to me that guys can do that, and I've seen players adjust. Either because of injuries or team circumstance throughout the course of the season and play extremely well. And so the fact that Roger could change it up and do that tells me that he's got a lot of potential. He's a young player. He's just got an exceptional feet. I mean, when you see an offensive lineman run a 4.9 40, his testing and his jumping and all of those different things, and you see his age, I just think his future is very, very bright. He's very smart. It's hard conceptually to change positions, especially in the offensive line. Guys understand their position, but then it changes. So it would be like, you know, if I made all you guys just go left-handed and start right and left-handed right now, or driving with a steering wheel on the other side of the car just right now and driving and going home, it would be weird for you. And that's kind of what it's like. And so when you see a guy do that, I think it tells you he's got some special qualities to him.
With Tez, you know, the thing that jumps out is his ability to stretch the field, the big plays, the best catches. Do you think that was something that, overall, big picture, when you were looking at the testing game, maybe that was something that was lacking? You wanted to address that in the draft?
Well, I mean, I think we were looking at potentially drafting a receiver at some point. We have receivers in every round. And, you know, they come in all different shapes and sizes. So we just drafted the best one in the 4th round. As we looked at the board, we had a couple players that we had highly rated in the 4th round. And, you know, honestly, he and TJ were at the top. And that's when really need factors in. You know, people say, well, we needed a receiver at that point. We had just drafted a corner. So we made the decision to take Tez at that spot. And it wasn't, you know, I've heard people say, oh, they took they drafted the big receiver because they needed the big receiver. Quite honestly, if it had been a smaller receiver there and he was the best player, we would have drafted him. It just came out to the situation where when we came into that day, the 3rd day of the draft, and we looked at the board, you know, those 2 guys, and there were some other guys too that were up there, but we had about 5 or 6 guys. We were hoping to get 2 of those guys with our picks, and we were blessed to do that, to get them. So it worked out very well, you know, for us. You know, there were receivers in the 2nd and 3rd round that we liked, that we could have taken. You know, we actually, I'll tell you, one of my sleepers in this draft was Pearsall. And, I mean, he went in the 1st round, which was crazy. I didn't, it was a great pick. I gave those guys a lot of credit. I thought that was a guy that we might get. That was a sleeper for us at some point, that we could take Pearsall, you know. He really wasn't like a hot commodity name. But that was another guy, like when you watched his game, super impressive player on tape. And that was, you know, that reminded me of the year that we were drafted, just for all the historians out here, the year we drafted Haloti. I really thought that, you know, we always want to have a fallback guy. You always think you have a fallback guy. And I really thought, oh, Dante Whitner, he'll be there 100% when we pick. And he went before Haloti, which shocked me. You know, I think shocked all of us. He was a good player. But, you know, as scouts, sometimes, you know, you don't really see the consensus bias. That doesn't really factor in. It's more like, oh, this guy is my guy. Nobody else really seems to like him as much as I like him. And so that Pearsall was one of those guys this year. You're like, oh, my God, because I really thought, oh, you know, that might be a nice pick for us at some point. He got picked. But Tez was a guy that, again, I never thought Tez would have been there in the 4th round. I thought, you know, Tez and even the Oregon guy, Franklin, both those guys, you know, I thought, oh, those guys will come off sometime in the 2nd day.
Have you adjusted, or do you anticipate you need to adjust scouting players with the kickoff rules that are being implemented in the NFL this year? How much does that maybe change things or traits that you're looking for?
You know, it hasn't really affected me at all, you know, or the scouts really, I would say. I mean, we're blessed. We've got a lot of special teams coaches, and we've got a Hall of Fame special teams coach back there, John Harbaugh. Those guys have a great grasp of all that, so they'll have some recommendations, and it's probably one of these things that we really won't know the answer till we get into it. I do think it'll probably change a little bit personnel, maybe slightly. You may want bigger guys blocking rather than smaller guys. I don't really know. There's been some discussion. I've heard some people say, oh, you want shiftier returners now rather than straight line returners. I've heard other guys say you want strong returners. And so I don't think anybody really exactly knows what it's going to entail until we get into it. And then next year at this time, I'd probably have a better answer for you, is what I would say.
Eric, I know you mentioned you called Wiggins the best cover corner in the draft, definitely an outside guy. Is Tampa a guy that might play inside? Does Marlon Humphrey move inside in your perception? And you have a lot of outside corners. I'm just curious if that figures in your calculus.
Well, I love having outside corners. They're tougher to find, I think. I think Wiggins can easily play inside too. And I showed you guys a clip of Tampa playing outside. So with Tampa, he's probably got the linear body that you would attribute mostly to outside corners. I think Wiggins has a great skill set as well outside because I think he can cover a team's best receiver, and most teams will have their best receiver outside. But I think we have great flexibility. I think Marlon can play the nickel. I think Wiggins can play the nickel. I think Tampa could play big nickel against a bigger inside receiver. I think with Kyle, we have a guy who's shown he can do it. I think Arthur, scrappy little Arthur, we all sleep on Arthur. He had a heck of a season for us last year, and I think he can do it too. So what we've done is build, I think, a nice combination of players who can all play multiple spots, which I think is going to give opposing offenses a tough time.
Following up on that, do you think Susie Kane has any slot kind of versatility?
Well, you know, again, I showed a rep of him doing it. Right now, I mean, I think he could maybe potentially do it. Maybe I'd have to see more and more of him doing it. But like right now, I think I'd love to see him go down and just fly around on special teams and develop as a third or fourth safety and become a Geno Stone or a player like that. It's hard to play the nickel. I mean, it's a very interesting skill set. You've got to be feisty. You've got to have some speed and quickness, change of direction. You've got to be able to tackle, and you've got to be able to blitz. And so it's a unique skill set. You know, back in the day, we used to talk about the third corner or the nickel as like the stepchild, so to speak. But over the years, through analytics and just through the fact that those guys are on the field so much, we treat the third corner or the nickel corner just as importantly in the draft board as we do outside corners.
Eric, you mentioned the importance of player recommendations. When it came to Adisa Isaac, what was it about his pitch, if you asked him, that sold you or added to what you were able to see just from development scouting?
Well, I mean, Adisa loved him, I think, you know, and just loved as a kid. But there's other people there. I mean, we have a great relationship with Coach Franklin. Kenny Sanders, who used to work with us, is out there as the I don't know what Kenny's title is now, Director of Player Personnel, I think. So that was great. And I'll be honest, you know, I was at the owners' meetings, and I was walking by. Some of you guys were there, and I was walking by, and I saw a good friend of mine, Dan Pompey, who I used to read as a kid, you know, with the Sporting News. And I was a big reader when people read magazines, and I love Dan Pompey. I think he's one of the great writers. And he had written an amazing article about Adisa Isaac that I had not read, and he shared it with me. And I read it, and I was just blown away by that. And so, you know, one of the things we look for in scouting, we look at adversity as a strength. When a guy's overcome tough circumstances, we look at that as something that's going to make him better. And I think Adisa has overcome a lot of adversity in his life in very powerful and meaningful ways. And he's a great football player. So when you combine those two things, it made a lot of sense for us to take him. The fact that Jordan Stout knows him, and the fact that Odafe knows him, and the fact that Coach Franklin loves him, and the fact that Kenny Sanders loves him, and all those different things, it's a cocktail. And it just made sense for us to take him at that point.
You do two more. We've seen sort of the transfer
portal, a lot of guys in college moving up the level sort of in competition late in their careers. How much has that made it easier to evaluate guys at all, like things that is how important was it to be able to get
Yeah.
on the field in those 8 games?
What I love about that is there's been a few guys over the years. What I think is cool is I think a hard thing is to transfer and be productive right away. And so I go back to a guy like Jordan Addison from 2 years ago. I was really impressed by him because he had been at Pitt. He was a great player in the ACC. And then he goes out to USC and he just duplicated it right away. That shows me, kind of like changing positions, that shows me that a guy has the ability to adapt quickly, which is what the NFL is all about. So it does give you a chance to see how guys handle themselves in different situations. One of the hardest parts of scouting is evaluating players at a lower level of competition. It's always been that way. Years ago, it started to become more apparent to me with the internet and mock drafts and all the media coverage and groupthink and all that there was like very accurate sort of lists of players, and the players were coming off as you'd expect them to. Whereas there was a period of time where it was very unpredictable. The market was very unpredictable, and you would see these crazy players getting selected by teams, and now it's almost like very predictable. You can see, highest rated players, okay, he's going to get picked now, he's going to get picked now. And we looked at small school scouting as really an opportunity for us to take advantage, to exploit some issues some other teams had. Teams really weren't allocating as many resources to small school scouting. And so we did that. I think we did it pretty effectively for a period of time. And then when COVID happened, we kind of pivoted because we thought it made the most sense to go after big school guys during COVID, because those guys were in big programs, they got the best training, they had the best nutrition, they were playing games, and we got away from small school scouting. That's a challenging thing. Like that'd be an amazing story for someone to look into, small school scouting, just because, and I could talk about this for 20 hours, but small school scouting is just different. You got guys that look like me at times playing. I played Division III football, and yet some guys end up being the best that ever do it, right? How do you find those guys? How do you take a guy like the Yale tackle this year, Amaji, and say, he's going to be every bit as good as Latham from Alabama? It's really hard to do, and yet they got picked within 80 spots of each other in the draft this year. It's really hard to do. Yale, Alabama, they play the same position. I think the small school aspect of the draft is crazily interesting, and some of my favorite picks we've ever had have been guys like Webby and Flacco and Ryan Jensen and Sealer, who was one that got away, and just those kind of guys, Matt Judon. That's a really interesting part of the draft, but it is very, very hard to equate a guy from Alabama to a guy from Yale, or to a center from Iowa versus a center from Colorado Pueblo. It's really hard to do.
Eric, is there, you mentioned the background in basketball for DJ Jam, but are there, if it's not giving away too much, are there kind of sports that you feel like success in that is predictive for particular positions?
I think, yeah. So, like basketball, I think is definitely there's some traits that would correspond to tight ends for sure. I mean, we've seen that. Offensive linemen, tackles, I think, as well. Baseball, outfielders, safeties, corners, ball skills, that kind of stuff, for sure. I think wrestling, again, we've had success with wrestlers. When you think about our team last year, we had a couple offensive linemen that were high school All-Americans, outstanding college wrestler with John Simpson and Tyler Linderbaum. I think just a tough, gritty sport. So I think that's another one. I think the other part of that, Jonas, is just like players that have had outstanding success at another sport gives you a little bit of insight into how they're wired, their competitiveness, their ability to master a craft or a sport or whatever that might be, their discipline, those kind of things. So it's important. Track, obviously, it's a different sort of sport, but if you see a guy that has his historic track times. It tells you that he's fast. I mean, and so, hurdlers, have always been kind of an interesting thing. High jumpers, those kind of things. We look at that a little bit. Yeah, it all kind of corresponds, but I think baseball, wrestling, basketball, those would be probably the biggest.
Do you go as far down the rabbit hole as like looking at what CUC did as a wrestler?
I don't think we necessarily did that in that case with him, but if we're looking for something, or we have information that, hey, you got to check this guy out. Like, I remember when Tyler Linderbaum came out, and, there was the viral clip of him wrestling. Again, you're like looking at a guy that's 270 pounds going against Tristan Wirfs, who's like the Iowa State champion however many years in a row, and he beats him. It's like, okay, this guy's got something to him, That's kind of a cool thing. Or, you get a guy that's drafted in baseball, it tells you that this guy has got some hand-eye coordination, because it's hard to be drafted. There's a lot of rounds, but still, to be a drafted baseball player, or to have like world-class track times or something like that, it definitely gives you some more information about a guy. And then, I think over the years, like I remember one of the great stories was Lionel Vitale. Lionel was one of our best scouts, just a very instinctive guy. Lionel just had a very unorthodox. I never knew where he was. He just worked on his own schedule. We never saw him. We never heard from him. He was on the streets. We never knew where Lionel was. But he would come back at the end of the season, and he would have all his reports, and he would have some players that nobody else knew about. And I remember he had been watching basketball, and he said, hey, there's this basketball player that I think has a chance to be a pretty good tackle or a pretty good tight end. And I said, really, Lionel? And he said, yeah, Central Michigan. I think it was Central Michigan. And so we ended up signing him as an undrafted free agent. And the guy's name is Joe Reitz. And he played with us for a couple of years. He started off as a tight end, but became a tackle. Signed a big deal with the Colts as their starting left tackle. And that was Lionel, and he watched him, and he was in the MAC basketball championship. And he just saw him, and he researched him. He goes, that guy looks like he could be a tackle. He looked him up, and he had a history of playing offensive line in high school, and the rest is history. And that's how we got him, based off of the fact that Lionel was just watching on TV. He was watching the Mid-American Conference basketball championships. And that's how it all came about. So it can happen. You're seeing more and more of that now with the international program. And, the Eagles, I got tremendous respect for what the Eagles do. And them drafted Jordan Mailata in the 7th round, I think was an incredible piece of scouting by those guys to find him in the left tackle in the 7th round. Just, crazy respect for Howie and those guys to do that at that point. And you see that sometimes. Ryan Grigson, who was the GM of the Colts, used to have a feel for that. He would scout players at all these different leagues and levels of play, and rugby players and CFL players. And, we probably don't do as good a job of that as we could. But, there are definitely unorthodox players out there at all different levels who have a chance. The Patriots have had success with that. They've converted guys. They've taken quarterbacks and made them receivers. Chris Hogan was a lacrosse player, right? So it can happen, but it takes a commitment by the organization. It takes some time and some investment to do it, and you've got to have the ability to develop those guys too.
You were generous, so I'll finish up with you.
Appreciate it. It feels like for so many of the guys you ended up taking this year, because of whether it be underweight or a bad 40 time or a bad senior week, it kind of fell to you, and you got guys that you had, and they were rated higher than when you ended up getting them. Was that typical, or do you think, relative to other drafts? Did you get more of that this year than most? All better for you in that regard?
Well, you're picking at the end of the round, and that presents unique challenges. And I'm all about value investing, and sometimes these types of things affect the market. And so, you might look at a 40 time and say, oh, he's too slow. I might look at it and say, well, if he had run a fast 40 time, he would have gotten picked in the top 15, right? So if you love him as a player and he runs a little bit slower and he drops, that might be an opportunity. You know, a couple of years ago we had Jim Kramer out here to speak to our scouts from CNBC, and he talked about value investing in companies and how he evaluates companies. It's all about the opportunity, and that's kind of what we think about it too. It's like, if the player's performance is such that you like the player and the opportunity is really good to get him, then take advantage of that. And so every little thing in some way can be an opportunity for you if you take advantage of it and you look at, like, where would he have been picked? I mean, I go back to one of our best picks ever, Terrell Suggs. You know, he ran a 4.84. I mean, Terrell Suggs was one of the most dominant college football players I've ever seen. I mean, just one of the very, very best I've ever seen. Should have been a top 3 pick. He had a bad pro day, and he fell to us, and I was sitting right there. Ozzie swooped in, and we couldn't believe it. And I saw history repeat itself with Kyle Hamilton in a lot of ways. And so the testing is important, but what's most important is how they play, how they act, and what people say about them. That's the most important thing.